Today on the Cameron Journal podcast, we are joined by JD Barker. He is originally from Lombard, Illinois, but now lives in New England, in a lovely home from the looks of it. Um, he writes thrillers. So we're talking fiction today. Um, and he has worked in magazines interviewing all your favorite people at 17, Teen Beat, all this type of thing. Um, and I love how he describes it. He cites those early endeavors as a crash course in lightning prose, which is true. And I was never good at writing that stuff, so good on him. Um, and uh, and then he released his first novel in 2012 called Forsaken, which had a little Stephen King tie-in. We'll find out more about that. And then in 2016, he had his debut thriller, The Fourth Monkey, which is really, really awesome. And then today we're going to find out. I didn't see in the information what book we're talking about today, but that's no mind because we'll find out very shortly. So, welcome, JD, to the Cameron Journal podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. That must be the new book over your shoulder there. What's it called?
It's called Something I Keep Upstairs. It's a haunted house story. It came out in May. It's about a 17-year-old kid. He gets pulled out of his class in high school by the local sheriff, and basically learns that his grandmother passed away, and he didn't have any relationship with her. He just kind of knew she was out there, but that she wasn't in touch with the family. But she left him a house on a private island right off the coast of the place where he lives. So he does exactly what you would expect if you inherit a house at 17 years old on a private island. He turns it into a party house for him and his friends.
Right.
Yeah, they basically go out there by boat. It's someplace they can get away from the parents and away from the police and just have some fun. But at some point, somebody raises their hand and says, "Hey, what would it take to turn this into a haunted house?" So they basically start right where you would expect. There's a couple of scary stories. There's a Ouija board, but the tagline for the book is, "For a haunted house to be born, somebody has to die." So you know where they're going, but the book is all about the journey. So it was a lot of fun to write.
Oh, good, good, good. That does sound quite exciting. I will worry when you start putting up haunted house decor in your home on an island. And so then we'll know that art is starting to imitate life too much. So thank you for saying that. I was reading over your bio. What got you into writing suspense and thrillers as opposed to magazine features?
I kind of stumbled into it. I was born in the 70s and we grew up without a TV in the house, mainly because there was nothing to watch. There were three channels at the time. It wasn't worth turning it on to begin with. But we spent a lot of time in the library, and I was reading at a very early age. And I had a sister who was 15 months younger than me. So I would make up stories and I would write them down and staple them. And I created a little library in my room, and she would check them out, and I would charge her late fees. And that's kind of where it all started. I was probably maybe 5 or 6 years old at that point. And over the years, my parents always encouraged writing as a hobby, and they added that caveat. It's a fantastic hobby, but you can't make a living at it. You have to get a real job. So I kind of followed that because I didn't know any better. So I finished up high school. I went off to college. I got a couple degrees, ended up working in finance. And during that entire time, I would come home at night and I would write. So in those early years, you had mentioned like 17 magazine and those kind of things. One of my very first jobs, I was in South Florida, and I was working for RCA Records, and I was essentially a glorified babysitter. I would have to pick up recording artists at the airport, get them to the radio stations for their interviews, get them to their hotel, get them to their concert, and then get them back on their airplane when everything was all said and done. And I was in college at the time while I was doing this. College is very expensive, and I realized I've got some very famous people trapped in a car with me for a week at a time. I'm going to start to interview them. So I did that, and I took those interviews and I sold them to whatever magazine I could find. So 17, Teen People, Tiger Beat, and to really date myself, this was people like Tiffany, Debbie Gibson, New Kids on the Block. Then we had a slew of hair bands. We had Poison, Motley Crue, Bon Jovi, Guns N' Roses. If I had everybody from Guns N' Roses in South Florida for a full week and nobody got arrested and I got them back on the airplane, that was a win. But I would interview all these people, and when you work with anybody at newspapers and magazines, you quickly realize they all have a novel at some stage of development in a desk drawer somewhere. They've been working on it for the last 10 years. It's 400,000 words long. It's almost done. They would hand it off to me and they would ask me, basically get my thoughts on it. I was very good with grammar and punctuation, but I also helped out on the developmental side. So I would kind of weigh in and tell them what I thought they needed to do to turn it into a publishable book. And that turned into a side hustle that I did for 20 some years, working as a book doctor and ghostwriter. So initially I just started working with, friends and people that I worked with in the industry, and then word kind of spread. Then I started getting, jobs from agents. They would, and editors, they would buy a book, let's say, that was, they loved, but it needed a little bit of work. And, the author, sometimes they're just not capable of doing it. If an editor tells you to take 40,000 words out of your book, that's a tough ask if you're a debut author. You're not used to doing that. Sometimes people were terrible at dialogue. Whatever the case may be, they would bring me in as a hired gun to fix those things. And I kind of think of that as a crash course, because I had the ears, or the editors from the biggest publishers in the industry basically telling me what they needed to see in a blockbuster novel, and I was tweaking those books and getting them to that point. Did that for 23 years while I was working the corporate gig during the daytime, and over those 23 years, I had 6 different books that hit the New York Times bestseller list that I had written, that all came out with other people's names on the cover, as a ghostwriter. That gets very old after a while. That 6th one hit up, and my wife pulled me aside and she said, "Listen, I know you want to become a full-time author. Let's find a way to make this happen." But we were kind of stuck at that point because I had a really good salary. We had a big house, we had cars, we had a boat. So our lifestyle was expensive. I couldn't just walk away from the job anymore. We needed the job. So she came up with this crazy plan. We sold everything that we owned. We bought a tiny little duplex in Pittsburgh and rented out one side to some tenants, and we moved into the other side, and basically lived off the rent that they paid us and got our expenses down to nothing, so I could sit there and write that first book. And that was the novel that you mentioned, Forsaken.
Hmm. I mean, that's quite a journey. I mean, that's quite a change and quite a journey. I appreciate that. I went through a similar thing early in my career. I figured out very quickly there wasn't a lot of money in creative writing, and I didn't even start till 2005, and the book industry, the publishing industry was changing a lot
Hmm.
at that time. Although in 2005 they had yet to discover email, which I always find endlessly hilarious. And uh and so yeah, I was planning on doing many other things. I fell into doing writing full time quite accidentally. I really intended to do something else, and I was like 22 and been like, "Oh yeah, I'll write in my, I'll get a job and write in my 40s, I'll make some money now and we'll get serious about the writing, in my 40s." Well, that's not what happened at all. And so I appreciate that you did all of that and then made it possible for yourself to make that really great career switch, and a huge hustle to be working finance by day and then coming home and fixing up blockbuster novels by night. I mean, that's a lot for anybody to
Yeah, but I mean,
take
what
on.
you just touched on, I think, is what happens to pretty much all of us. We like I got comfortable in that finance job. I hated the job, but it paid really good, so that makes it hard to
Mhm.
walk away. And you keep telling
Absolutely.
yourself, I'll get to the writing later. I'll get to it later. I'll get to it later. And I was 43 when I published that first book. Like, those years creep by pretty fast. And, when I had that conversation with my wife, the thought in my head was, like, the last 30 years flew by. The next 30 will go by just as quick. And at some point, I'm going to be sitting on a porch in a rocking chair, thinking, what if? Because I never actually pulled the trigger on it. And I run into so many people that are kind of caught in that boat. They're working a job they can't stand. They really want to paint, or they want to sing, or they want to write music, or they want to do this, they want to do that. But they never actually pull that trigger. And, it's tough. It's very hard to actually do it, but you have to do it.
No, no, quite so. Yeah, I ended up spending years and years creating a whole media brand and then books and everything like that. And then I broke down and got an MFA after I said I never would. So that's fun. Um, to try to turn this crazy thing I do into a dollar. Which is as hard as it is in 2025 as it was in 2005. Let's talk a little bit about process. Um, how do you, as someone who's fixed so many difficult books and all this type of thing, how do you start? How do you get those early ideas onto the page?
Well, I was, you can see my bookcase behind me. There's only 2 books back there actually on the process of writing. One of them is Drunk and White. The elements they basically give you all the grammatical rules that you need on this tiny little book. And the other one that I've got is Stephen King's On Writing. which I think teaches you everything you really need to know about the craft. One of the things that he preaches in there is he's what they call a pantser, so he basically comes up
Mm.
with his crazy scenario. He comes up with his characters. He drops them into that crazy scenario and kind of lets it all play out on paper. And he doesn't know where the story is going. And he does it on purpose because he feels if he doesn't know, the reader will never figure it out. So I always, at the beginning felt that was the way you had to do it. So my first couple of books, I pantsed them. I had my crazy idea. I dropped my characters in there and just kind of ran with it. I would typically write, 140, 160,000 words on a book. And then in the editing process, I take maybe 40 to 60,000 out and end up somewhere around 110, 120 or so. So there's a lot of, basically wasted words on the cutting room floor. But to me, that was the process. That was the way you were supposed to do it. When my second book came out, it was called The Fourth Monkey. My publisher at the time, which is HarperCollins now, they sent out ARC copies, advanced reader copies, to a bunch of big name authors, hoping to get that blurb for the back cover. One of the guys who got one was James Patterson. And he actually liked the book enough where he called me up and we started talking about it. And eventually we decided to write something together. And we weren't sure it was going to work because, I was coming at it as a pantser. He is a notorious outliner. He writes 30 to 50 pages of outline before he actually starts writing the book. So two very different camps. But I actually convinced him to pants a novel, the first and only time he's ever actually done that. So I would write a chapter, I would send it off to him. He would write another chapter, send it back to me. We'd try to paint each other into these crazy scenarios and, it just became this twisty novel. And we got done. And we went through the same process I always did, tons of cutting at the end, a lot of editing, but we, ended up with a fantastic book. But when it was over, he said, okay, we tried it your way. Let's try it my way. Here's an outline. And he sent me an outline for a book called The Noise. And I wrote that book with them. And honestly, like it flew by. Like we went through it without any real, hiccups or anything. We had the story in front of us the whole time. And there was very little editing at the end. And we got done in record time. So like he basically, he taught me how to outline. I thought I was going to turn him into a pantser and it went the other way around. He turned me into an outliner. So today's world, I basically have a process that I follow that is very similar to, we've written 6 books together at this point. Basically, very similar process to what Jim and I do. We come up with the idea for the book, essentially write the back of book blurb. So those 200 words that would appear on the back of the paperback or in your Amazon listing. We just come up with a condensed version of what the story is about, come up with a title, come up with a tagline. Then we get to work on that outline and we perfect the outline before we actually start the writing process. And that's what I've been doing ever since. And I enjoy that a lot.
No, no. I always ask this question because I've been taking an informal poll of people who come on the show to find out who pants and who outlines. I'm a hardcore outliner. Hardcore. Since day one, the pants thing never worked for me. I would write 20, 30 pages, have no clue where to go, and that would be the end of it.
Yeah.
So for me, outlining was incredibly freeing. The pantsers out, the pantsers outnumber the outline people by 10 times. There are very, very few outliners that will come on the show. But this story is really interesting because you start out as one and switch to the other, which is really interesting. But of course, in the best way with one of the best people. So, that's pretty amazing.
Well, it's a tricky thing to do. And I think, when I first tried to outline on my own, and I did try it before, I think I approached it the same way a lot of other authors do. I created the outline and I felt like that was the story that I had to tell. And I didn't diverge from that outline. And I would usually get, maybe 2, 3, maybe 10 chapters or something in. I would come up with some unique idea to twist it. And all of a sudden I'm not on the outline anymore. The story's going off in its own direction. And I would just chuck the outline and finish the book. And one of the things that I learned with Patterson is you keep the outline dynamic, so you write the outline before you start writing the book. But if you come up with one of those ideas before you actually implement it, you go through the outline and you make that change. So you come up with this idea for a twist in the book, you update the outline to match that twist. And if you do that and you continue to do that as you're writing, the outline changes with you as you're writing the book. But it stays a lot tighter. And what I find is I live on an island now, and I go for a run every day. It's I do about 4 miles. It takes me about an hour or so, and I use that time to think about what I'm writing the next day. And when I was pantsing a novel, it was always about figuring out what comes next, what comes next, what comes next, and hopefully I came up with something before I put my butt back in the chair. But now that I've got the outline in front of me, I already know what comes next. So I use that same time to figure out how do I make what comes next better. And tighten it up. And the outline, the books themselves, I think, have been a lot tighter ever since I started doing that.
Yeah, I know. I think people fall into that same trap of thinking once you have the outline, you're stuck to it and you're slavishly tied to it. And I'm the first to say, oh, no, 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 no. I change the outline all the time. No, my outline's a living document and things get changed, things get moved around, all this type of thing. I just enjoy having a plan. And most importantly, and I don't know if you find this, I enjoy having the chance to work out difficult problems before I'm 50,000 words in, you
Oh,
know.
absolutely. I mean, if you've got, let's say you decide that you don't like this particular character anymore.
Yeah.
If you've got to go through an entire book and remove a character, that might take, a couple weeks. You never know. There's a lot of editing involved in that. But if you need to do it in an
Right.
outline, you can knock that out in 10 minutes and you're right back on track again. It's
Yeah.
so much easier to work out the kinks.
Well, yeah, and also especially, not that it's that common these days, but for books that are terribly complicated with a lot of characters or multiple outlines going at once, in my mind, planning, it's like an assembly line. You need the drivetrain to meet the body at the same time. And it can be if you don't have a plan in place, you can end up with somebody arriving to where they need to be much, much sooner than other parts are ready and available. So it's a very very essential sort of thing. And I think it also helps. I think in fact I had a book with this where I realized along the way, despite having an outline, I'd sort of dropped a character. They had sort of written themselves out of the story. I think an outline is a great place to go. Like even if you're in it and you've realized this, you can go back to the outline rather than trying to thumb through thousands of words. You can go back through the outline and be like, okay, where did this person start to fade, sort of
Yeah.
thing. And be like, is that natural? Is that kind of the way it's supposed to be? We no longer really need to, their contributions to the story are gone, or have I made a mistake and I need to start including them in more things? Again, having an outline where I can just scroll backwards real quick and be kind of like, aha, this is where I stopped talking about them. Does that make sense narratively, or do I need to add them back in? I think it becomes a helpful resource along the way, even in late stages.
Yeah, and that's so important to be able to do that. I've seen some people, like they would approach that same situation and they would feel, well, the character's already in the first 20,000 words. I've got to keep them in for the rest. So they will
Yeah.
force themselves to keep that character alive and keep them in the story. And the readers pick up on that. Like if you as the author, if you're not into it and you try to force it through, then the reader gets bored with it. They can feel that somehow as they're going through the story. And but you can't be afraid to try it either. Try taking it out, see what happens. It's easy enough to go back and pull them out of the story later, or you could be 20,000 words in and come up with an idea for a character that wasn't there that all of a sudden should be there. You plug them in at that 20,000 word mark and go back later and add them back at the beginning. But it all needs to
Yeah.
stay fluid until you get that first draft done.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. And as someone who's done quite a bit of developmental editing work in the recent couple years, I just kind of got into that post MFA. As I've gotten into that stuff, I've found just in different ways people approach things, interesting problems, interesting ways to help people solve problems. I helped a buddy of mine, he writes scripts for AAA video games, and he's writing his first novel, and it's kind of a it's a zombie. I don't want to give it away because it's so good. It's a zombie novel that kind of breaks the rules of the genre a little bit. He has people that are infected but aren't zombies, like, which is
Oh,
really
okay.
yeah, really kind of cool. And also the infected kind of farm the non-infected people, which I thought was an interesting change. Um and we went through and did a bunch of these different things and ideas and how to solve problems, make things a little bit longer, do more of the setting because this world is so rich and we're not getting it sort of thing. And it's always very interesting now having done a book like About Not Losing, which is a nonfiction book about a malpractice trial with a doctor, to something like that, all the different problems and things you kind of run into and how with a little cutting, a little clipping, making things a little bit more efficient, all this type of thing, stories that were really bland and boring really start to come to life. Um, and I think that process is interesting, which kind of gets me into revision. When I did my MFA, our program director revision was her theme for my very first semester, which is a little awkward because I had came to that program having written 3 books, but I was in my first semester, so I hadn't written the book I was going to write for that program, sort of thing. And she was always about revise, revise, revise. I'll admit, and this is perhaps a weakness, I don't tend to overwork books. I tend to get it finished. I read it once. I do my grammar edit. I do a story, and I'm editing a story along the way, and that's kind of it. Like, once I've said all I've had to say and I've worked out the problems I know are there, I'm kind of done. What's your revision process? How many times do you go back over something?
I don't know if you want to hear it based on that. Mine's pretty extensive. So I'll write the first draft. Then I hand that off to my wife. She's what I call my alpha reader.
Yeah.
She's learned over the years to just be extremely critical of everything I write. She'll tell me if something sucks. She won't hold back, which is important. You need to have somebody that's willing to do that. After she reads it, I go through and I do another edit based on her suggestions. From there, it goes to my beta readers, and I've got a team of them. I usually try to keep at least 6 of them going at any given time. And they all
Hmm.
approach it from different skill sets. So to give you an example, one of the girls that I work with, she's autistic, and she is very good at grabbing. If I use a sentence on page 13 and I use that same phrase on page 347, she will remember it and she'll red flag that kind of thing. But I've got 6 different people that I use as beta readers. I've learned over the years, for me, I prefer to give them a printed copy of the book, and force them to go through paper rather than an electronic copy. I get more comments back when I do that. And I give them very specific instructions. I write thrillers, so everything has to be fast paced. Those pages need to constantly flip. So one of the instructions I give them, to give you an example, I ask them to highlight any place where they find themselves skimming. So if they're skimming the text for whatever reason, they run through it with a highlighter. So when I get all those copies back from my beta readers, if I see multiple people have skimmed the same section, I know as an author I need to go in there and do something about it. I also ask them to tell me where they felt it was okay to close the book. I don't care if they have to make dinner, if they have to go pick up the kids from school. I don't care what their reason for closing the book is. I just want to know where they thought it was okay to close it. So I have them mark those particular pages too. And if I see multiple people closing the book at the same spot, I know I've got a dead spot, something I need to fix. So I go through that. Once I get all their copies back, I do another full revision on it. From there, it goes through to my editor that handles my grammar and punctuation and all that kind of stuff. Then I do one final clean draft. So really about 6 different revisions before it actually goes anywhere, before I share it with like my agent or my editor.
Yeah.
But I've learned over the years, working behind the scenes in the industry, when you're selling, particularly to like the top 5, you're going to get a much bigger check as an advance if you can give them a novel that doesn't need any work. Years ago, an editor could take on if they liked an idea for a story, but the book needed work, they could take it on. They could spend 6 months to a year working with that author trying to perfect it. But in today's world, they don't have that bandwidth anymore. They've got too many projects they're working on. Everything is just being squeezed too tight. So they're looking for that perfect book. So if they get a book on their desk and it's a 5-star read, it doesn't need a whole lot of work, they will offer top dollar for that. And I've gotten multiple 7-figure deals because of that that theory. So like I know that holds. It's unfortunate. I miss the days when an editor could take on a project and work with an author and tweak it. But that market just isn't there anymore.
No, no, that's good. I think yeah, I think I enjoy the fact you're so open to feedback from beta readers. I know that's a very popular thing to do. I think there's a lot of of wisdom in it. In my debut novel, I actually had hired someone to edit it, and I had some interest from a couple agents in New York. The problem is the murder, the main event, like a couple other books I modeled it off of, happens a little bit too far in. And I kind of knew that going in, and I was kind of like, I think they're gonna like it, but I said, I know what the first comment's going to be, and it's going to be move the murder forward to the first 50 pages. Unfortunately, the book doesn't work. If there's no reason that you have to have this reason for it to happen, and it takes a little bit of distance to get there. So after having full manuscript reads and having a few really great conversations with people, I published it myself. And it yeah, I think it's an interesting interesting story thing. But that sort of getting all that feedback from people, that's too much for my brain. I'd get lost in the sauce on that. I think that's kind of magical that you can take all of that, synthesize it together, and kind of figure out the common patterns for all of that. I have such a vision for what I want it to be in the experience I want to create, that I would get absolutely, or I'd agree with everyone. I'd be like, well, person number three had, yes, I agree with absolutely, but person number six liked that. Well, I would be lost in all that. How do you balance all that incoming feedback?
I think you have to take a step back and take your author hat off and put the editor hat on, or think of it more
Yeah,
of a product instead of a work of art or something that you created.
right.
I personally, I never stop writing. So when I finish a book, the very next day I'm starting on a new book. So by the time I get into the beta process and the editing process with all these different people, I'm already knee deep into another story. And I think that's helpful because when you're already working on something else, going back and making cuts or making big changes, you're just not emotionally attached to it as much as you were before, because you've already moved on to something else. When I was working as a book doctor, I mean, what you just mentioned, that particular problem happens all the time, because people tend to set their scene, they create their world, they introduce their characters, they do all these things before the main event actually happens. And one of the things I used to do as a book doctor, a lot of times I would cut the first chapter, the first 3 or 4 chapters, and basically eliminate everything you just mentioned. Start the book
Mhm.
where the murder takes place or very close to it, and then go back to those chapters that I cut and find some way to sprinkle that information in later in the story. So we don't lose it, we just repurpose it and use it somewhere else. People's attention spans in today's world, for better or worse, are very short.
They
People
are.
used to read a book and they might give it 50 pages, 100 pages before they decide to put it down. But today's
Yeah.
world, you got to grab them with that first sentence, that first paragraph, and like you can't let them go, especially with thrillers.
No, yes, I always laugh, and this happened recently with my intern. Um, as I people are always kind of like, "Oh, I'd love to read your novel," and I'm kind of like, "Yeah, you're not gonna like it though," and they never believe me, and I send it to them, and inevitably they didn't. Um, and then I said, "But you should try the short story collection." It's called an unfinished coloring book. And I said, you should give the short story collection a try. And then usually the next conversation is, oh my goodness, I liked it so much better. It was so much more fun, all this stuff. I'm like, that's the usual response. Like, it's shorter, it's faster. I kind of get right to the point. The action begins immediately, sort of thing. And so I yes, it caters much better to today's short short attention spans. I think that's why some genres, especially like murder mystery, because they're oftentimes so formulaic, people really know what to expect, and those books tend to do well because of that sort of thing. So, and yeah, I think especially in thrillers like you, right? Yeah, it's got to be action packed from the word go. You have to kind of drop the reader right into a very tense moment. um and then ride that wave of tension all the way through the book. So that definitely makes sense given what you do. I appreciate that. And also balancing all that feedback is very important. I don't know if you like to do this because you move on so quickly to things, but I love to let a book sit for a while after I finish it. I won't look at a book that I've just finished for a while, several months. I'll put it away, sort of thing. How fast, from, I guess, start to finish, what is your timeline there?
Well, it takes me about 3 months to basically get the novel off my desk the first time before it starts going out to the alpha and beta readers.
Gotcha.
But yeah, I mean, taking a month like that, I think, is huge because when you pick that book back up again, you're looking at it as a reader instead of as the author. And I think those problems, they're a lot more glaring. Like you can see them.
Mm,
So in my world, like I said, I finish up a book and then I start the next one right away. So then it goes off to my alpha reader. She usually takes about 2 weeks. Then it, comes back and I'll do a quick edit. Then it goes to my beta readers. I give them 30 days. So now I'm almost 2 months out. From the actual writing process. And the further I get, the easier it is for me to make some of these changes to the story. I think at some point you have to, just step away and just realize this is something that, you are going to sell. It's a product. People either, if there's something in there that they're not going to like, if you can fix it in some way or another, you got to fix it. I really think every book's got to be a 5-star read before it hits the general public, just to compete, in today's world. I mean, there's probably a million books published every year, and your book is one of them. If you're coming out with something that's a 2.5-star read, or it's got potential problems in it, and you're putting it out like that, you're basically approaching it with a handicap, and it's so hard to succeed, even if you have that 5-star read, let alone a book that's got some problems. I'm curious, did the MFA program help you as far as, did it improve your writing, do you think, or did it just change your writing from A to B?
Um, I did not get into it to change or fix my writing. I got into it to have more access to be a real professional in the industry. Um, and I wanted to go in a more academic direction. I want to do some fellowships and some stuff that I could not do as just kind of Cameron, man who publishes books around town. It did change my writing in very subtle ways I didn't realize till it was over, to answer your question. That was not what I went to the program to do at all. But by the time I got done with it, I discovered it had changed quite a lot. In so much as I can immediately tell when I read something if it was written before or after I did the MFA.
Okay.
There's a fiction book I'm reading right now that I opened it up, I read the first page, changed 50,000 things, and it immediately sounded way better. I think in an odd way, all the reading other people's work, the talking with people, the getting exposed to different sort of things did end up changing my writing in ways I did not anticipate.
I'm always curious about that, because I've never had any kind of formal training. I read a lot, and I think I
Yeah.
read so much, particularly as a kid, like the framework of a story just got embedded in my head. Like everything I write is a 3-act structure, but I never have actually studied 3-act structures. It's just it feels like
Yeah.
once you have that framework and you understand it, like if I go beyond, like a particular twist needs to happen here, and I go beyond that without writing it, it almost feels like I missed a turn on a highway, and I've got to back it up and go back to it again. So I think you intrinsically
Yeah.
feel those spots.
No, I mean, I was even telling my intern who was not a fan of the debut novel, as no one is, and like the short story collection better. I sent him the first chapter of my next two fiction books. One is the one I wrote during my MFA program. One is the one that I've been fixing since my MFA program, and he liked those much better. I think it did. The writing did get better in very odd little ways, mostly because I think things are smoother, it's more connected. I think there's just more refinement and polish. It's the difference between being a journeyman and a master. I was quite, if I was a mason doing blocks, I was quite good at doing the blocks, and the blocks looked okay, but it takes a master to build Notre Dame. And I feel like that it gave me a level of refinement to the work that I didn't necessarily know that was there and was to be unlocked. I think it was, and I think it was just getting exposed to different people. I mean, I was writing, in my MFA program, I was writing this book called The Sweetgrass Saga, which is a sweeping Southern epic. It's basically Downton Abbey set in the antebellum South. And my advisor I had for half the program was a Cuban from South Florida who I don't think had ever seen Gone with the Wind. So I'm trying, and I mean, I'm literally trying to create the world of 1850 for someone who has no clue about, no reference in their head as to what it would be or all this sort of thing. And I think it made me learn how to say a lot with very little,
Mhm.
kind of say a lot with as few words as possible. And I think it just got, there was just, again, just a certain level of polish and refinement, little things like, I was in a workshop and I was reading a short story that had been published in a journal called 34th Parallel. And the guy who was running the workshop was a guy named Richard Panic, who's a very famous author, lives in Manhattan. He's doing that life. And he said, I like your story concept. You have a syntax error in the first sentence.
Oh no.
Had never realized that, had gone through multiple rounds of it, had been published in a journal with the same syntax error. I've noticed since the MFA, little things like that tend not to happen anymore. I think that like that sort of little stuff of being like no, do read it aloud. It has to sound this way. It has to convey this mood. It completely changed kind of how I put things down, and it's very different. And it's funny because when I sent those chapters to my intern, he wrote back and he was kind of like, "Oh wow, this is so different." And I'm like, "Well, the first two were written before. These were one was written during and the other one was fixed afterwards. That's how the night and day difference is." And that was from someone who started that program with a major journal publishing, with books already on sale. I'd already been on Australia television talking about, I'd already sold books globally, all this sort of thing. And yeah, it just really cleaned it up. So that was a long answer to your question. I'm sorry about that.
No, no, I think it's important for people to hear that. I mean, personally, I think everybody's got to write, at least a 500,000 words or so before they really find their voice and figure out what they're doing. An MFA program is a fantastic way to do what you did. There's a website called AutoCrit, which I recommend to a lot
Yes.
of people. You can upload your entire novel in there, and it'll point out there's a tab called Strong Writing. That's my favorite tab. It'll
Yeah.
red flag basically all these errors, like passive voice and showing versus telling, adverbs, and basically all the rookie mistakes that we all make. It
Yeah.
underlines them in red, forces you to have to change them. And what I like about that process is because you have to do the work to actually fix it. If you do that enough, you're going to find that you're no longer like in future writing, you don't make those mistakes anymore. You work those issues out in your head before they actually hit paper. So it will
Yeah.
teach you, strong writing. But nobody comes out of the gate and just writes, the perfect bestseller. Like it doesn't happen. It's like going to the
Yeah.
gym. Like you have to hit the gym on a regular basis. You've got to constantly stay at it to keep that the writing muscle working. And if you don't, it gets soft. It's all very similar.
No, no, I one of the things I love about modern technology, I still love to edit on paper. My Sweetgrass Saga, I printed out 504 pages at the UPS store, and went through it. And I already had a shopping list of stuff I knew I wanted to cut. Like whole chapters. Like we're teaching 13 and 16. These bits at the end, we can save them for book two. They're lovely, but not important right now.
Mhm.
And I still love sitting with that like that. But I also love New School with tools. I recommend AutoCrit in my writing course as The Power of Story, but I also love using Grammarly because it finds all sorts of weird, strange things. And for me, I look through its errors and then I start reading around. And then I'm kind of like, okay, this and this is a problem, but this paragraph's not working. Like, and then all of a sudden, my Grammarly edit is now turned into basically a revision sort of thing, as it kind of brings up, and it brings up, an awkward construction, a sentence that's too long, and then you end up looking around and being like, oh yeah, this passage is actually a little bit difficult and all this sort of thing. And so you get into, into all these revisions and everything. So that's always quite exciting. Something people inquire about a lot, and I want to ask you because you play at that level in a way that I do not. Um, what is your best advice for people trying to break in traditional publishing? I get letters weekly about this all the time. Everyone wants to know. And I tell them the same thing. There is a process to it. It can be done, but it is a long process. It is a difficult process. You will face a ton of rejection. As someone who's been playing in that world for a long time, what's your best advice on traditional publishing?
Well, I've got two different things I'll throw out there. First off, a lot of people tend to do, what you had mentioned earlier. So they'll write a book, they query a bunch of agents, they get a bunch of rejections. So then they decide, well, I'm just going to go ahead and put it up on Amazon on my own, which is valid. You can do that. But what ends up happening is a book goes out with potential problems in it. So what I advise people to do is reach out to those agents. If they don't tell you why they're rejecting the book, see if you can get that out of them. And most of them, if you reply back and just say, hey, just tell me why, most of them will respond back and they'll give you some constructive feedback. And you can use that information to retool the book and fix a lot of those errors. I personally feel everybody should try the traditional route at least once. Get through the agenting process. Hopefully you get an agent. Hopefully you get an editor. Hopefully you get picked up by one of the big publishers, just so you can experience that world. So you can see your book going through a full-on editing process, through the cover design process, see the audiobook get made, see foreign translations happen. Just get that experience under your belt. Because then if you decide after that, I'm going to go ahead and indie publish something, you understand all the pieces of the machine. You understand how it's supposed to work, and I think that's really, really important. So I try to get everybody to at least go that route at least one time before they go the indie route. And I love indie publishing. My very first book, I indie published it. My second book, I sold traditional. The third one, I sold traditional. But I had gotten a taste of that indie world, and it's tough to back away from that. The economics of it are fantastic. You get 70 cents on the dollar, versus a traditional deal where you're lucky to get 15 or 20 cents on the dollar. They might give you a nice big advance check, but you've got to pay that money back, and you've got to sell a lot of copies of the book to do that.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to try and experience all that so you can make those kind of decisions. The other piece of advice I'll give you is on the querying process itself. A lot of people, when they're ready to query an agent, they jump on Google and say, type in something like, what is the perfect query letter? And all these blog posts are going to come up telling you exactly how you should format your query letter.
And the several dozen
is,
books written on the subject, yes.
Yeah, every author queries the same way, and if you talk to an agent, today's Monday, an agent gets in the office first thing Monday morning, they open up their email, they're going to have 200 to 300 submissions in there. And if every one of them is formatted exactly the same, following the same model, they start going through them just like the rest of us would a big inbox. You read a little bit of the first one, you hit delete, read some more of the next one, hit delete. Before you know it, you're hitting delete before you're even reading anything, just flying through that box. So you have to find some way to make yourself stand out. So to give you an example, I've got a buddy of mine. He wrote a novel, and it's basically like a Jason Bourne kind of situation that takes place in New York. And he was querying, and he wasn't getting anywhere. So we started talking about his query letter. In his day job, he actually works security in New York for diplomats. So when a diplomat flies into New York, he's on their security detail, and he basically keeps them safe while they're in the city. So we decided to incorporate that. So we changed his query letter and made the very first line, "I carry a gun in New York." So imagine an agent going through their inbox, they're hitting delete, delete, delete. All of a sudden they come across an email that starts with, "I carry a gun in New York." That puts the brakes on, and they read the rest of that query letter. So just finding something that just gets you to stand out from the masses, and is so important. Not just with agents, but once you publish your book, you've got to stand out against the other books. It's something you have to continue to do. I mean, when I market a book, like I make a list of what I see everybody else doing to market their books, and then I try to come up with something totally different. To give you an example, the book behind me, something I keep upstairs, the haunted house in the book is actually real. You can visit it. So as part of the promotion for this book, I gave away an overnight stay in the haunted house. We drew the name of one person. They got to pick 3 of their friends, and we literally took them out to a haunted island on a boat, dropped them off on the dock, and let them stay in a haunted house, for 24 hours all by themselves. When I announced that contest, the press ate it up. We got tons of press coverage. It was covered on television. It was covered on newspapers and magazines. People were talking on social media. All that buzz was free. So like you can't beat that. Like I can buy Facebook and Amazon ads just like everybody else, but if you can come up with a way to get word of mouth going, that's what's going to sell your book.
No, I talk about that in the other half of my life. Is I'm the VP of Branding Creative at Soup Media, and we started as a publishing company in transition to a media company because we were with a lot of thought leaders and a lot of nonfiction. And if you're listening to this right now, which you will be listening to it in November, December, our new anthology, Fantastic Worlds, is out with fantasy and sci-fi. Please go buy. It has tons of great stuff in there. In my life, I tell people over and over and over again, I said, it's the word of mouth marketing. This is why I harp on press releases must go out on time. We have to be engaging with influencers and people. We built our own podcast network to get word of mouth going. All of these things, because that's really what moves books. It really, and that's been true the entire time I've been in this industry. And so I'm not surprised that a promotion like that creates lots of what we call earned media in the business, did so well and created that word of mouth buzz you need. So that's quite tremendous. Speaking of marketing though, and then we're going to go because your generators held out on us and we're not going to push our luck. But when it comes to book marketing, I know that at the big publishers, they do a lot because they have access to Barnes and Noble, and books are on shelf, and I'm sure you're on a real shelf and all this sort of thing as compared to some of the rest of us who only live on the digital shelf. And I know marketing budgets at the big 5 are pretty slim these days. What does marketing a book nowadays look like besides great giveaways to stay in haunted houses? What are they doing? What are you doing? What's that world looking like?
Honestly, it's a little depressing because I've had books with all the big publishers, and a couple of them I've had multiple books with them, and I had one I don't want to say the publisher's name, but I had a book with them a few years back, and they sent me it's essentially a PowerPoint presentation of the marketing plan for that book. I had a new book with them about a year ago, and I got their marketing plan, and it was literally the exact same presentation, other than somebody had done kind of find replace for the book title and swapped out a couple of graphics, which is telling me as a business person they haven't changed anything that they're doing from a marketing standpoint from 5 years ago. And this world is evolving so quickly. Like you have to change, you have to adapt if you want to succeed. From my standpoint, I'm in a weird situation right now because I've got my own imprint over at Simon and Schuster. So I've got my own publishing house, but Simon and Schuster handles my print sales and distribution. So 100% of the marketing for those books falls on me. But when I publish something through one of the other publishers, I'll take that marketing plan and I try to punch holes in it. I figure out okay, this is what they're doing, what aren't they doing, and then I tend to do those things on my own. I don't tell them what I'm doing because that's going to cause them to to pull back on their side. If I tell them I'm going to run Facebook ads, then they're going to not run Facebook ads. So I don't tell them what I'm doing. I just try to offset what they're doing. But thinking outside the box, I think is key. You always just have to do something different than what everybody else is doing. Otherwise, you just kind of fall in and get lost in the noise.
Yeah, no, absolutely. All right. Well, your generator's done such a good job with staying with us this whole time. So before the power runs out, let us know where we can find you online and keep up with you on social media, and we'll get you out of here.
Oh, easiest place to find me is at jdbarker.com. I'm on all the social medias at jdbarker. And the books are pretty much in every bookstore.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on the Cameron Journal podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
That's all for this episode of the Cameron Journal podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Visit us online at CameronJournal.com. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and I love to talk to my followers and listeners, so please feel free to get us on social media at Cameron Cowan on Twitter, and we'll see you next time on the Cameron Journal podcast. Thank you.